And what came next was a film called Dead Again, which arrived. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. A script I remember with many fingerprints on it. That's how many people have turned it down because it's a sort of quirky, rather eccentric story about involving reincarnation. But I thought it was an excellent piece of writing, and Scott Frank, who wrote it, has since written many very fine screenplays and has become a very good friend. But I did have to have a moment where I had to persuade Paramount Pictures that it would be a good idea to cast Emma Thompson in the two double parts opposite me, which I think there was some suspicion of nepotism because we were then married. And I said, well, I can understand how you might feel that way, but nevertheless, I am here to tell you, regardless of what the future may bring, that at some point you will be on your knees to try and get a woman like this into your picture. So please cast her, because she's a copper-bottomed star and a talent of the first rate, and she ought to be in this and many other movies. So they were easily persuaded.
You also directed two, I guess I'd say, adaptations of classic works, Frankenstein and Sleuth. With Frankenstein, what appealed to you about telling a new version of Mary Shelley's story?
I'd done so much work on Hamlet that Frankenstein, the character, seemed a sort of a reverse of that coin, where, or a sort of parallel figure, I don't know how to describe it, where if Hamlet is about grief and the, amongst many other things, but if it's at least about grief and the difficulty that we face accepting loss, you know, if Hamlet's problem is his father died, and he does not feel that his mother has grieved long enough for his father, that there hasn't been this period, this ritual of mourning. And I sometimes think the entire play of Hamlet would be completely redundant if Hamlet and Gertrude would just have had like half an hour, a cup of tea one morning to say, wasn't it terrible, or had some memorial for him instead of coping with it in their different ways. But whereas Victor Frankenstein sort of defies death, simply says, I won't have this. And so that defiance, that hubris of man against what appears to be God's plan at that point in human development, that sort of rage of man against God and nature, I found that very, as generations since it was written have done, and in other versions of that myth, very, very compelling. And the whole experience was sort of a little mad, you know, because of a huge production and being at the center of it and all the sets and everything, sort of getting into shape for it, and kind of everything was sort of obsessive about it. I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'd run to work, or at least I'd be dropped about 6 miles from Shepperton Studios. I'd run the rest of the way, and then I'd get made up, and then I'd have to be there before anybody else. And then so I was a bit Frankensteinian as I did it, you know. It was for me, it was a joy and a revelation to work with De Niro. And as I was saying the other night, we had this scene where he's born, and we ended up sort of semi-naked together in a ton of KY jelly, wrestling. Seemed a strange way to get to know Robert, but probably better than he would have wished. But it was fascinating to see him. One of the things I like doing, and it was such a treat then, it would be even more now, is whoever it is, I enjoy when I know I'm going to work with an actor, just reviewing their work. I mean, in the sense of just going back and seeing it again. So rather like My Week with Marilyn, which involved watching everything Olivier had done, before working with Robert, I watched everything that he'd done, and that's like a sort of free class at film acting school or something. And then to see him do it and be so surprising, you know, with the two of us waiting to do a scene, and the two lads playing messengers who are going to come in and give some news to the professor, and you know, it was obviously it was urgent news, and so we were waiting to do it. The two guys are jumping up and down, they're doing press ups and everything, and you know, getting out of breath, and okay, ready to go. Oh no, we just need 2 minutes, and then they do it again and everything, and him just, you know, looking bemused, you know, like why they were going to all of this trouble, and him to, yeah, cool. You know, why are they doing that? And I said, well, you're the reason they're doing that, is because, you know, they think that now they're coming into a scene breathless, they're making themselves breathless. He said, you only need to do it when they say action. Which the boys heard and were completely astonished by, because, you know, we assumed that, you know, the man who, you know, played Jake LaMotta and put on all that weight and everything was extreme to a degree, but he was a combination of these things. And when we've spoken about, indeed you and I have spoken about the kind of difference, say in My Week with Marilyn, between the idea of the method and something more traditional or classical, Robert to me was an interesting example of just whatever works for whatever scene and whatever part. So I'm sure on another occasion he might have made himself breathless, or he might have done something, but I felt with him, and what I kind of sensed with Olivier is, like Ulysses, they have a great deal of cunning as actors about how to best use their energies, and they don't necessarily, my experience of watching people like this, they don't necessarily have a single approach. And so to watch him, you know, just do that particular performance was great. To see, and I've nicked lots of things since. He loved having DPs don't, but he loved having many cameras running, and sometimes having the wide shot being photographed at the same time as the close shot, which is difficult for sound and picture, but means that you've got a consistency of performance that you can cut to, and tricks, I suppose, to keep himself fresh, and so he was a remarkable person to learn from.
I'm always curious about specifically people who work with De Niro and direct De Niro. Do you ever have discussions where you're arguing a point with him because he's De Niro?
I wouldn't argue with him. not expect to leave in one piece. I wouldn't.
And have you ever been intimidated? You've worked with so many amazing actors.
Lots, plenty intimidated. Yeah, but it's the way you look at it, isn't it? You think you just a little shift, as Hamlet says, there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And so intimidation can be excitement, just like that, John Gielgud, who I worked with a number of times, was somebody who it's just impossible to be in the same room and not feel, from that 16-year-old boy who got the idea from a teacher who perhaps was irresponsible that I could be an actor. I then read everything about the theatre I possibly could, and was encyclopedic actually, really, and then, not anymore, but in my knowledge of particularly the 60s, but much further back as well. I read biographies and theatrical magazines, and so when I would sit this close to John Gielgud, we're playing Romeo and Juliet on the radio, and I'm playing Romeo, and he's being Father Laurence, and I know that he's played Romeo to Laurence Olivier's Mercutio, and I know that he was Alfred Hitchcock's secret agent, and I know that he was Cassius in Joseph Mankiewicz' Julius Caesar with Brando, and I know that he was Arthur in Arthur's butler in Arthur, and won his Oscar for that, and that he worked with George Bernard Shaw, and his stage debut was in 1924 at the Old Vic Theatre, and all of this stuff. It's very hard to think of anything interesting to say, because I also know this guy's played in front of prime ministers and presidents. And no, you know, the truth is, of course, once you start working with even the most exalted of individuals, they're just human beings, just like us, and you know, we know that that's true. But it's kind of exciting to be a bit awed by them as well. Then you get, of course, very inspired. You want to be good in the scene. I was always fine once we started acting together. And of course, I watched what he was doing, and his technical ability was great. What was amazing about him, though, for somebody who was perhaps associated with being a sort of very classical English Shakespearean actor of a certain kind that perhaps some people would dismiss as being rather technical, he was so real, so utterly natural. And he and Brando got on like that when they did Julius Caesar, and they spoke a lot about doing Shakespeare. Brando's a sensation in that movie, I think. And I think if Gielgud had an influence in that, I wouldn't be surprised. But so it's daft to be intimidated, because it's, you know, it's a beautiful thing that you're anywhere near such great talents. And but yeah, you have to take a few deep breaths from time to time. Yeah.
Last year, you might have seemed like an unusual choice to direct Thor, just because it's a comic adaptation. I actually find it very Shakespearean in many ways. Who first approached you with that idea?
My agent, Robert Newman, with whom I just sort of signed, had been full of, sort of offbeat ideas, and sort of I'd asked, listen, hey, I'm interested to be surprised and stimulated by any kind of different sorts of thoughts. I go and watch lots of different kinds of movies, so it's time for maybe thinking about different kind of directions. And so he sent a message one day saying, would you ever think about directing Thor? And I said immediately yes, because it was alone amongst comic books. I'm not a comic book geek, but I absolutely knew Thor and well from my time when I was a kid in Belfast. That's when I started being aware of it, and I was quite excited. That really was an unusual choice, and I like the combination of how primitive Thor is. I like the fact that he's an extremely strong individual, and I like this hammer, this sort of blunt, rather brilliant thing, and yet it turns out to be he turns out to be very virtuosic with it. And I like the fact also he's primitive, but the story can travel across realms and through space, and so it has that sort of fantastical and pretty surreal and eccentric quality that I think is also fun if you want to go to the movies. I want to go to the movies and see things that I would not see on television, that I would not see in the theatre. I want to see something in the cinema that really will be unique to and play to the strengths of that medium, and those qualities in the story seem to me to have all of that. But there was a spine available to us, which was this story of a young prince who needs to, prove himself to be a sort of capable leader, and a son who gains, for what it's worth to him, his father's approval, and set against a brother who wants to try and do the same thing. There was essentially a kind of a story about fathers and sons at the centre of it that I thought anchored all of that, and so I like the idea that it could have the ambition of a big popular movie and try and be sensory, give you big sound and big music and big effects, but also have at its heart character and believability on the human scale.
For your acting career, how do you choose your roles?
Well, sometimes I don't choose. Sometimes it depends what shows up. You look for something that grabs your attention, and I think we're all creatures who like to sort of surprise, and you hope that there's a variety in what you do. It's for instance, with My Week with Marilyn, obviously you can tell from this conversation that Laurence Olivier has had a huge influence on my career and many others. But just as I mentioned with Niro, the idea of being able to go back and look at his work, learn from it, and there was so much to absorb yourself in, so much to kind of get your teeth into as an actor. And what I love watching acting that you can't see, and I guess what I've come to understand is that that's very difficult to do, and that people who do it are most impressive to me, and it's beautiful when even if they're doing something big, or there's an accent, or there's something in between, or it's a very characterful performance, it's lovely to see invisible acting, and that's, I guess, what I'm drawn to that, to answer your question. Where can I try, where's the part where I can do the least?
It seems like you've played a lot of real life people in your career, from Franklin Roosevelt to Ernest Henry Shackleton to actually a couple of Nazis. What's that about, actually?
It's a uniform. Well, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to know if there's a pattern, if there is any pattern to why you're drawn to certain things. But that thing we're just talking about, actually, of that sort of invisible acting, with something like Conspiracy, a film in which I played Hydra. Thank you very much. Thank you. In fact, I saw today Frank Pearson, who directed it, was at the nominees' luncheon today. Former president of the Academy, indeed, and Oscar-winning screenwriter himself. And that was such a scary read, that screenplay, such a sort of insidious account of how 15 fellows around a table over a period of 90 minutes, real time, it's just 90 minutes, they decided that they would kill 11 million Jews. Just, we've got chilling stuff to read. It was a great performance from the great Stanley Tucci. And I remember even what makes me give the shivers when I think of it now. He was sitting next to me at this table, saying, and so we have some land now. We've found a place in Upper Silesia. It's called Auschwitz, and we can get. And the way it was sort of dropped in was so shocking, and it was just on reading that screenplay, I thought that that would be something. It was important, and it was terrifying, and it was a difficult thing to do because on all sorts of levels. The subject matter itself couldn't but be sort of harrowing if you watched it, and certainly if you were in it. And then the requirement to really try and do no acting at all was so total that why Nazis? Well, in that case, that was such a compelling story where it could not be done. That was one of those ones that came along and you thought, well, you have to do this. You've got to do this.
Speaking of real life people, that obviously brings us to My Week with Marilyn and Sir Laurence Olivier. You've been compared to him a lot in your career, starting with Henry V. You both directed, adapted, starred in productions of Henry V and Hamlet. Did it almost seem inevitable you'd play him someday, or did you avoid it for that reason?
I think the opposite. It was inevitable. In a way, the comparison thing, it's funny, in our country anyway, he was such a... when I came into the business, he was the name on everyone's lips as the actor. So my mum and dad that's who they think of as the actor. And maybe in America at that time they would have thought it was still Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando, when you talk about the great actor, is Marlon Brando over here, and Laurence Olivier over there. In the broadest terms, of course, they loved many, 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 many more actors than that, but it was that simple. And literally everybody was compared to Olivier. He did so much work because he was a great film star, he was a great man of the theatre, he'd done so many classical roles, that in England, if you pursued any kind of classical career, i.e. if you did Shakespeare plays or period plays, then it just was, every review would start with, but for those who've seen Olivier, but if you saw Olivier, and that would be absolutely the case. It didn't matter who you were. And then I suppose if you didn't fail completely, you were then compared favourably. But this happened for the generation of actors that was Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole. It happened for the generation of actors that was Anthony Hopkins and Ian McKellen. And then, because he was still dominating things, it happened for my generation, and perhaps inevitably because of the simple fact of doing a film of Henry V that he obviously had done spectacularly. And so it couldn't be avoided, but it wasn't something that would stop you doing it, because a trillion productions of Henry V had happened since the play was written, and just because of the nature of the film medium, there were never going to be that many film versions, but there will be another one. There'll be lots more, maybe another one soon, perhaps. And people might get compared to ours and to his as well. That's just in the nature of things, I think. But on the whole, one feels as though it's nice to sort of perhaps be at some points considered for who you are and what you've become, and so one never wanted to sort of go down that road again. But this came along, and it was Simon Curtis, who's a great director and somebody I'd worked with before, David Parfit, from way back. Most importantly, it was a very, very vivid account of a great hero in difficulty and behind the scenes, and it was an opportunity to talk a bit about the very things we've been talking about, this idea about acting. He says in the film, as Paula Strasberg says, Marilyn's only interested in truth, and he says that we're agreed on that. We absolutely want truth, and if you can fake that, you'll have a great career, which is part of the paradox of what we do. Even at our most committed to the truth, you still got to show up somewhere. There's still a kind of element of it that can't just be entirely spontaneous, or at least mostly that's the case. So things about the nature of art were there, but very subtly. Because it's an easy watch, it's an easy read, and it appears on the surface to be a very sort of simple kind of movie, and I think it is in a beautiful way. Simple's difficult, but it also has layers of meaning, I think, that are really attractive, and to play him, as I say, was to go back to college, and in the end it was just all too irresistible. So I essentially felt very honoured. And then I also felt, without getting too sort of pretentious about it, that it was, in a strange way, it was a way of saying thank you very much for all that inspiration.
Even the unflattering scenes.
Well, I think no one is more candid about what happened than he is in his own Confessions of an Actor and the other book on acting, and in other material interviews and things. He's very candid about how thrown he was by Marilyn, how sort of emasculated he felt. He felt he was not good in the movie. He might argue that he was a little indiscreet in how he spoke about it, but no more indiscreet than we are in making a film about it. So that was one of the reasons in the end one decided one could do it, because he'd written largely about it. And Anthony Hopkins, who, as you know, was in Thor, worked with Olivier on Mutiny on the Bounty in, I think, 83 or 84. And he said they got very drunk together the night before Olivier's scenes. And Olivier was still banging on about Marilyn then, still completely...
Couldn't let it go.
Well, he couldn't quite... I guess he was still trying to work out why it didn't work. He was still perplexed by what, in theory, could or should have been a sort of tremendous collaboration. She was the biggest movie star in the world. He was the sort of greatest actor. She was happily married just recently to Arthur Miller. It was her own production company. It was a great opportunity for him. It should all have been terrific, and it was a disaster, for them.
You made a film called Prince and the Showgirl, which you directed and acted in with Marilyn Monroe. What was she like to work with?
Well, she was a very curious little person. She was there's a proper word for it, but I think it always sounds very horrid. She was a divided personality. When I first met her, I thought she was the most enchanting thing I'd ever met in my life. And it was impossible then, when she was like that, and she was like that in ordinary life, it was impossible not really to fall a little bit in love with her, absolutely at first meeting. And I was looking forward madly to working with her, because I admired her so much. I thought she was a witty actress, as well as being so ravishingly lovely. And I was longing to do a film with somebody like that. And it was a very exciting prospect for me, but it didn't work out to be either exciting or enjoyable. And I found out the reason for this later. She was always late, sometimes 4 hours late. Now that obviously isn't just being naughty. That's obviously something that's a sort of something chronic. I mean, that's a problem, that is. She would she'd say, just a minute, I have to be excused for a minute. And I'd know it would be an hour and a half before I got her back.
Why do you think it didn't work?
I think, I don't know, and I don't, the film sort of tries to look at possible reasons why. I think it was tough for him, if I'm correct, to have her as his boss, for her not to show up on time. I think that he felt that that was the basic requirement, was that you could kind of be difficult or temperamental. He was used to all of that. He was married to Vivian Leigh. They were having a very tough time. So he knew about, you know, difficult artists. He was one himself. But I guess he just couldn't handle the lateness.
Now, you never got to meet Olivier, but you have worked with and are friends with many people who did work with him.
Yeah.
Was there any insight you gleaned from that?
They talked about, I mean, Tony Hopkins and Derek Jacobi both talked about how Olivier would be all things to all people. You know, he was many characters in a day. He would be your genial host. He would be, the serious academic type, although he, in truth, everyone says he wasn't very academic, but he was sort of brilliantly, intuitively smart. He could be very sort of bitchy and camp. He could be, and he could be rather grand and, sort of representing the British theatre. He was a bit of everything. Gielgud said this about him, that you never quite knew who you were getting. But everything was a kind of performance, brilliant performance, but you didn't quite know who he was the impression that they gave. But both Hopkins and Jacobi both said, as a leader in the National Theatre, where they were all there with Ian McKellen and Albert Finney and Maggie Smith, that he was quite wonderful, really an inspiring figure. And if you just look at his industry, and that group of actors that he developed at the National Theatre in the 60s was really a very sterling group of people. He knew talent when he saw it. Can you possibly imagine a better way to serve detention than by helping me to answer my fan mail?
Not really.
Fame is a fickle friend, Harry. Celebrity is as celebrity does. Remember that.
I want to thank you so much for, I know how busy you are, for coming out tonight.
Oh, thank
thank
you.
you guys for being such a great audience, and congratulations on everything.
Thanks very much.